Welcome to Scouting Hot Finds Radio. This is episode 92. This is a podcast meant for scouting memorabilia collectors. Been recording this podcast now for going on 10 years. And hopefully in 2021, the goal that I've stated is to get out a podcast episode every 2 weeks. So far in 2021, I'm on schedule, haven't missed a deadline yet. So I hope you enjoy this interview with another interesting character from the scouting memorabilia hobby. This is an interview with Bill Chadek, who lives in Nebraska. Enjoy. This is Scouting Hot Finds Radio. Jason Spangler, Sasanti Swapper, your host. My guest is Bill Chadek, who I came across on Facebook. Bill has a really interesting story that I will kind of tease here. Basically, what Bill does is take vintage scout knives, hand axes, and kind of refurbishes them, makes them into almost works of art that I have seen Scoutmasters purchase and give out to Eagle Scout candidates and just all kinds of cool stuff. And so I was intrigued by this because I love those old Western knives. So I invited Bill to come on the podcast and tell us. So, Bill, thank you for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome, Jason. I'm glad to be here.
Bill, my first question I try to get out of people is, can you just give us your scouting backstory to help us understand how you got to this point?
I started in Cub Scouts, and my mom was actually our den mother, and I was pretty terrible at Cub Scouts. I earned my wolf badge and a gold arrow and a silver arrow, and that was about it. I lost interest, and since I wasn't in, Mom bailed out on being a den mother. When I was in fifth grade, and I believe we could enter Boy Scouts at about that time, we had a pretty dynamic person move into the town by the name of Merle Yelkin, an ex-Marine who became the Scoutmaster, and huge influence. He ran a great program, and I went through Boy Scouts. Our summer camp was Camp Cedars in Fremont, Nebraska. I got to go to the 1964 Jamboree in Valley Forge. And when I was 16, I earned my Eagle in April of 1968. And since then, college, yada, yada, became a teacher. And while I was a teacher, I was also a merit badge counselor for Citizenship in the Nation. And strangely enough, since I worked at a golf course, I also became a golf merit badge instructor.
All right, well, that kind of brings us to the point of this interview, which is your whole project that you've been doing for some time. Where did you come up with the idea of this business, Bill?
My brother passed away. He was also an Eagle Scout back in 1987. And I was sitting on his box of memorabilia for a long, long time. And it just came to a point where I needed to part it out, so to speak. And so I started putting stuff online. I'd been an eBay member since 2004, and very surprised at the price that some of his items were bringing, especially Order of the Arrow items. We were members of Pohawk Lodge, which has now been merged with Chapaa in Iowa to form Kitkehakuka. And while I was doing that, another member of our scout troop at the Jamboree contacted me and wanted to know if I would be interested in his dad's collection, who was one of our scoutmasters at the Jamboree. So I went in and I looked at his huge collection of stuff and purchased it and brought that home, and over many months parted that out. It's been more of a just kind of a make money for my fishing trips to Canada venture. What we're talking about, I kind of got off the subject there, was how I got into the knives part, so to speak. And I went through all my records and purchases, and the earliest one that I could find was off of another site, not eBay, and it was in 2011. So I've been at this about 10 years now. And I purchased a Remington RS-333 pocket knife that wasn't in terrible condition, and I got it at a good price. And I kind of thought, well, if I clean this up a little bit and repair the handle, it had a bone handle, and I had extra bone scales. So I cut out a piece that fit real well and put it in, and then polished up the knife and put that back on eBay and resold it for, a decent profit, nothing fantastic. So I thought, well, okay, there's a lot of knives out there. And 11 years ago, they were selling stuff pretty much on the cheap, Jason. You could get a decent pocket knife for $15, $18, and if I cleaned it up, I could make $35 or $40 on it. So they were Boy Scout knives, Cub Scout knives, Girl Scout, and these are all pocket knives. And then I started thinking, well, maybe they'd sell a little better if I made a sheath with them. So the leather I first used was terrible leather. I mean, I was getting it from Hobby Lobby in a bag of scraps and trying to piece stuff together. That didn't work, and I ended up going to candy leather after a while and buying some decent material. The sheaths, I did a lot of research on those, and YouTube has just got tons of information out there. And I learned how to make a jig so I could form my leather around it. And it's all been kind of a learning process. My first sheaths were pretty crude, but now I think I've got it down to a process where I produce a pretty fine product, really.
And so how did you know there was a market for these refurbished sheaths and knives? Because if people have not looked at your listings, they actually fetch a pretty penny now. I've seen them on eBay.
The market kind of fell on me just with what I was doing with the pocket knives. And back in 2013, I think it was, I got a Kit Carson. There was a Kit Carson box and sheath. There was no hatchet and knife with it. And I purchased that and resold the box. And then I started looking at the sheath, and it was pretty well beat up, and it was flimsy, and it just didn't hold up over the years very well. And after that, the same year, I purchased a 1937 Plum and figured, well, if I could fix this up the way I've been doing the knives, it might sell a little better. I also got a Western knife and did the same thing in the process. Depending on the knife, if here's part of the problem, and I'll let your listeners know. When you store the knife and the hatchet in the sheath for long periods of time, the leather draws moisture out of the air. And I mean, there are hatchets and knives out there that I could get real cheap, but they're so pitted that there's no way you can clean them up. The ones that aren't too poorly taken care of, I'll start with a 220 grit sandpaper and start working it. And from there, I work up the grits to a 320, a 400, a 600, 800 grit. I finish with 1,000 grit sandpaper and then put it on my polishing wheel to try and bring out a luster on them. Whether I knew there was a market or not, I wasn't sure. But once some of my sets came up and they were fetching a good profit for me, I thought, okay, this is something that I could do and make some Canada fishing money.
Well, I've often said that I sell patches in order to have money to buy new patches, so I can understand where you're coming from. So, Bill, I'm intrigued by the Kit Carson, that classic set that many of us have seen. It seems like now you've been able to kind of reproduce those. I've seen you sell several versions of that. Can you kind of tell us about that classic Kit Carson set?
Yeah. And in this PDF file that talks about Boy Scout plum hatchets, I always thought the Kit Carson kit came out in the 50s, and this is mentioned, the first ones came out in 1938 to 1942. And as the plum hatchets changed style, the Kit Carson kit always stayed the same. They just changed the style of the plum hatchet and sometimes the knives. Western knives weren't introduced until I think the 1950s. They used to even have K-bar and marbles knives went with them. So going back to that first sheath that I bought without the knife and hatchet with it, as I looked at it and looked at the flimsiness of it, I decided I could copy the pattern but make it better. I cut the front piece out to fit the knife, and then I cut another piece and make a fold-over sheath, not the pocket sheath that the knife slides into. And with that, I run a spine up almost to the top of where the hatchet would go in. So it's double thickness there, and it gives it a lot more strength and rigidity. And I also looked at the pole end of the hatchet sheath, and it was just folded over and had one little rivet at the bottom and 3 rivets at the back, which kind of tend to rip out. And what I've done now is when I form the leather around the hatchet, after I glue it together, and then I put 3 rivets in on one side and I stitch it up on the other side to give it a lot more strength. And I put 2 rivets on the bottom piece to hold the hatchet in. And again, my first ones are a little more crude. The pattern was the same, but since then I've taken to finishing the edges out using it's just called an edger, and cut the sharp edges off and of the leather. I finish them, I slick the edges, and then I will coat them with 5-Bing's edge coat, and then I put another product called 5-Bing's Resolene over the whole thing, which is kind of a waterproofer, and so it keeps moisture from drawing into the leather along the edges and the leather itself.
And Bill, one thing I've been wondering since sort of following you is, how do you source these original knives and hand axes that you work with?
Well, I'll tell you, Jason, sourcing's getting a lot tougher. As I said earlier, I used to be able to pick up pocket knives and even Western knives fairly cheap, $20, $18 9 years ago. Even hatchets you could get around $20 to $25. And I think, and maybe this sounds a little vain, but with the finished products that I've put out there, I've noticed a lot more hatchets and knives coming out on the eBay market, and the prices are just going through the roof. There are people out there that want $100, $150 for a rusty old plum. Now, whether they get it or not, I don't know. But it's getting a lot harder and harder for me to find something that's workable that still has at least somewhat of a profit margin with it. Other sources, I've gone to some auctions where there are scout knives advertised, and antique stores. But being out here in the middle of Nebraska, I certainly don't have the scouting resources that you guys do on the East Coast with your population and probably, just a lot larger population of aging scouts out there.
And Bill, what other similar projects have you tackled, or do you have, ideas for new products that you want to try to create?
Well, besides the Kit Carson, I've done a few adaptations on that. There's a guy on the West Coast. His name is Steve Reed. His eBay handle is Knife Handler knife holder Steve, I think. Absolutely stunning knife work. I mean, it puts my stuff in the back seat. And he had a Bridgeport hatchet out there with a burl, not walnut. It was a burl type handle with an aluminum pommel on it. I purchased that from him with another idea in mind. I had a pocket knife, and I got the same type of burl scales and finished the pocket knife. So I made a Kit Carson style sheath only with a pocket knife instead of the Western knife. And I've done several of those then with the hatchet and pocket knives. And one I did with a hatchet and a pocket knife, and then one of the old Boy Scout sharpening stones connected to it. Other than that, I mean, my ideas for creating stuff for sheaths is fairly limited. I'll make single sheaths, and I've had requests, but as for similarity, the other projects, I just search for stuff that I can buy and resource out. If you looked at my site recently, there was a Lodge 202 Chickasaw F1C patch that I picked up, oddly enough, from a site in France, and made a profit off that. So I just I'm kind of the American picker of Boy Scout stuff, I guess. I look and try to find stuff that I can resell. That's about it.
So, for example, Bill, if somebody wanted to get a custom sheath, maybe with their initials in it or something like that, is that something that you've ever considered?
I've done a few. It's a little different ball game when I'm doing work and just putting it out there, and if somebody likes it to buy it, fine, as opposed to, hey, I want to commission you to do this, and there's a little more pressure involved. So I've been somewhat reluctant to do it that way. I know you contacted me about redoing a sheath, and I took a look at it, and I said, well, yeah, I can fix that up. I had one mother contact me on Facebook, and her son was he was entering Scouts, and his grandfather had given him his old hatchet, and she asked if I'd make a sheath for it. And I took this one just off measurements. I usually like to have the hatchet with me because there's a lot of differences between them. If I make a sheath for a Bridgeport, for example, it won't fit a plumb hatchet because the pole ends are a lot skinnier. And so she sent me the measurements, and I gave it a shot, and she wanted his initials on it, so I put them on the back also. And yeah, I've done maybe a half dozen to 8 requests, but generally I kind of shy away from them just so I can do stuff on my own time, if you know what I mean.
Well, you kind of already led to my next question, which is, how has Facebook helped your business? I see you on Facebook a lot.
Well, it's helped a lot, especially with the eyes on my projects that I put out there, because I will put it on Boy Scout memorabilia collectors. There's 2 or 3 sites out there. I'll watch the listing as soon as I put it on. The listing views will jump, from 1 or 2 to 20, just almost immediately. The last hatchet I had up was a 1938, 1940 plum, which I restored even down to using gold leaf on where it says official Scout Axe, and that came out real nice. And the page views on that was 517. So yeah, eBay's helped, or Facebook has helped me at least get the product out there so people can see it.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you so much for coming on my show tonight. There's a couple of things that listeners need to look for in the show notes page at scoutpatchcollectors.com. One of those is a PDF reference book that you mentioned. It's called Plum BSA Scout Axe, A History and Timeline. And this is a great resource that you mentioned from Cedar CedarRiverForge.com. We'll include that. It's a free PDF they have up. And then
Right.
I'll also include a link to your email if some people want to reach out to you, maybe try to get something commission work or just get suggestions. And then, of course, a link to your eBay items so they can follow you there. But thank you so much for the little personal project you did for me. I had a Western knife and the sheath and all the threads had ripped out and it was coming loose. And you know, just out of the kindness of your heart, and I guess because we had talked about this podcast, you fixed it up for me, and now it looks beautiful. And my son, who's 11 years old, is actually very anxious for Dad to pass that down to him.
Well, when you sent the knife along, it kind of took me back also a little bit, but I figured, well, as long as I got the knife, I'll see if I can't spruce it up a little bit. I think I polished the pommel and the guard for you, and didn't do a full blown because I didn't know what you wanted on it, but I was more than happy to work with it.
No, it turned out great. Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Bill Chadek. I told you he was a character. I really like the idea of sort of someone being an entrepreneur, coming up with an idea, and you can see by the results he's had that the items he's creating are really, really popular. They resonate with some people. Be sure to go to my website, scoutpatchcollectors.com. You'll find the show notes page there. And again, I'll have links there, including some pictures of some of his finished products. Now, if you're willing to help support me in 2021 to have the goal of getting an episode published every 2 weeks, I would invite you to go to my Patreon group, scoutinghotfinds.com. We call that group the Scouting Hot Finds Insiders. And I can tell you that for this episode 92, I actually have about another 10 minutes of audio that I recorded with Bill that is part of the exclusive content insiders can get. I call that little segment after the interview. And so I saved one kind of interesting, somewhat tricky question for Bill, and I included that in the after the interview. And then also we talked about the possibility of me sending him some axes and knives, and you'll hear a little bit of our back and forth there. So in that Patreon group, I have some other exclusive content, videos and other clips. You can go there and check it out. The basic idea is that the podcast is completely free to listen to. Of course, it's not free to pay the hosting, hire an audio editor, etc. And so I try to set up a platform where listeners could contribute even just $2 a month, which would work out to be $1 per episode, just to help with some of the production costs of putting out this podcast along with the other videos that I do. So I hope you'll consider doing that. It's a little awkward to ask for support in that way, but at the same time, if you have a project that you really enjoy, maybe it would not be too big of an ask. Guys, I will have another episode of Scouting Hot Finds Radio published in 2 weeks. I've got a couple of people lined up to interview, and I just need to work out some schedules and figure out who's going to go on next. So definitely stay tuned. Remember that Scouting Hot Finds Radio can be found on all of the popular podcast playing apps. If you are an iPhone user like I am, you can definitely find it on the podcast app native to iOS. You can also find us on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker. The list goes on and on. The show notes, again, are at scoutpatchcollectors.com. You can also find there all 92 episodes of the podcast archived, and you can listen to them, see the show notes page, and just kind of see more about what I've got going on in the scouting collecting community. Thanks very much. Again, Jason Spangler, the Santee Swapper, your host.